Georgia Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C. at We At Radio. Do something, please.
Hello, this is Elliot Fineman, your host for It's the Gun Stupid radio show. And we're so happy that you're joining us today. As you know, our show is the one show that really speaks about the hard issues regarding the gun control situation and the gun safety situation, I should say, as well as we listen to the positions and arguments made by the pro-gunners who take positions that we feel often threaten and lead to the lack of gun safety. But we don't mix any conversation here. We talk right to the point. We have a very exciting show today. On the pro-gun safety side, we have Lois Schaefer, a devoted mother who lost her daughter in a horrible way to gun violence and has written a book about it called The Unthinkable, Life Loss and a Mother's Mission to Ban Illegal Guns. And we'll be talking with her shortly. And on the pro-gun side, we have a gentleman named Kyle Copeland who formed an organization in Houston called the Armed Citizen Project, the goal of which is to arm citizens in high crime areas with 20 gauge shotguns. So to find out if in fact that can lead to a defensive position for them and make the crime less prevalent in those areas. So we'll be getting to those two interesting people later on. But first, as we always do, we start off with the kind of a look at the current news events, and joining me to do that is our senior editor, Martha Rosenberg. Martha, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi there, Elliot. How are you?
I am good. I know you were out this afternoon, so glad to have you back in time. We had gone over several interesting and I think important news articles this week. And I think the two we selected, one concerned the horrific shooting at the Jewish Community Center in Kansas City this past week. And the other was a very fascinating piece you wrote about the flip-flop of the NRA's official position on conceal and carry. When they were very much for it, and now against it rather, and now that they're very much for it, and you tied that into some very interesting racial considerations. But let's talk about the shooting at the community center. I think we both know that the shooter was. I don't know if deranged is the right word. Certainly by my standards, they were deranged. This was a person who had a violent history, was a white supremacist, a big devotee of the Turner Diaries, which calls for armed revolution and predicts that the pro-gunners ultimately take over a nuclear facility in California and ultimately rule the world. Talk about fantasy. Nonetheless, this guy was bright, he was articulate, he was known to be a danger. It was a threat to, an announced threat to the Morris Dees, the head of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and really a bad news person. And he, at the age of, had started as a young man. At the age of 72, I think he was 73 maybe, decided to walk over to a community center with, because it was Jewish, with completely unarmed, unprotected, undefended people, uh, and opened fire, ironically killing three people, none of them who were Jewish, because this was a multi religious ceremony, I think, regarding a singing contest. Uh, anyway, Martha, the question is that we always get asked, and I know you've been asked a lot about it on Facebook and other places that you write, is how can we stop this? Any thoughts?
Well, certainly, Elliot. The thought with many of these people, the individual we're talking about, he's named Fraser Glenn Miller or Fraser Glenn Cross, depending on the news source. But he had spent 3 years in the penitentiary, and so he was a convicted felon. So the issue with people like him, one of the first issues is the gun show loophole, because he could waltz into a gun show or a private sales situation and get a firearm. They said at this killing on Sunday he had a handgun, a shotgun, and possibly an assault weapon. So the first issue would be the gun show loophole and other pro-criminal laws that the NRA has on the books that enable anybody to become armed. But another issue is hate groups, and we can speak more about the hate groups as we talk about, some of the racism of the NRA. But, certainly he had been noted as operating. He was arrested as a felon or went to the penitentiary for operating a paramilitary camp. So his white power groups were known to the authorities, and so the two questions would be the gun show loophole and why a hate group such as his and many others that the Southern Poverty Law Center chronicles and is aware of, why they're not monitored better.
Well, I think the issue of the hate groups, we know the issue of the gun show loophole. And we know that it must be closed. We know that one of the things our side fighting for gun safety is fighting for is that every gun sale require a background check. Why any rational person would be opposed to that, of course, is bewildering to our side. But the reason, of course, is that the pro-gunners are so paranoid that if you pass any single law, rational as it may be, for gun safety, that's the first step towards gun confiscation. So they'd rather pass no laws and leave the gun situation unsafe. The irony of that is that there is no defense against gun confiscation. By not passing any laws, that doesn't defend against gun confiscation in the slightest bit, because the government can take away everybody's guns and doesn't need to know where a single gun is. The kind of government they fear, even though Heller says everyone can have a gun at home for self-defense, so it would be breaking the Constitution, a government that would take guns away. But the kind of government they fear could do that in an instant, just by passing laws that no one could have a gun, and if anyone was caught with one, jail for 15 years and $1 million fine. And they'd also pay informers to tell you who had a gun. Oh, and by the way, since they've been listening to our conversations for 10 years, they also already know who has guns. So the confiscation thing is just a red herring, but unfortunately, enough of them believe that. But your point about the hate groups is well made. And we had this discussion during the week where I wondered why we didn't use our sedition laws to break up these hate groups. What do you think about that?
Well, you're absolutely right, Elliot. And, David Duke, who was very well known as a Ku Klux Klan leader from Louisiana,
I know.
And he's still around, but he used to be better known. He and other Klan leaders are big fans of the NRA and members because there's a real overlap between hate groups and gun rights groups, and it should be apparent to anyone that there's this big overlap.
Well, the question is, when I've been asked during the week, how would we stop this assassin, this killer that went to the Jewish Community Center? Uh, the point I've made is that if sedition, it's right in the Constitution, says you cannot call for the overthrow of the government, as these hate groups do. You cannot call for violence. You cannot be speaking the things that they speak. And we have a way of dealing with it. And ironically, the last sedition case that came up was under George Bush, where they went after a woman soldier, a female soldier who had spoken out against what the army was doing in Iraq. So that they went after for sedition. They lost the case, by the way, but they put that woman through hell. And here we have armed hate groups, over 1,000 of them. We know who they are. We know what they say. We have the ability to go after them under sedition, and we don't do anything. So I hold our side, our government at fault here. So that's one. The other thing, Martha, is I'd like to talk, since we're coming kind of near the end of our segment, I'd like you to talk about the interesting piece you wrote this week, then put on our Facebook page. It was a blog you wrote about the swing, the flip-flop of the NRA's position on conceal and carry. Could you share that with our listeners, please?
Yes, I certainly will, and I urge everyone to visit our our Facebook to see this element that we put up this week. Basically, in 1967, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and Black Power was a big thing, and some of your listeners won't remember this, but it was the Black Panthers and Black Power and not taking oppression from police and that type of thing. And he passed in 1967 in California a law called the Mulford Act, M-U-L-F-O-R-D Act, and his statement along with passing and signing the bill was that no citizens should be afraid to walk on the street, that they would be shot with somebody carrying a weapon on the street. And it was, kind of like what we say today. And the NRA supported that and supported Reagan. And then, of course, what happened is there was a change in the color of the law-abiding citizens carrying weapons, and consequently NRA completely switched and did a 180-degree on concealed carry.
Well, so the point is the very argument that Reagan made and based the law on, which is no citizen should fear walking down the street being shot by a gun, that everyone at the NRA agreed with, and is our biggest complaint now. I mean, you and I have talked about this. I don't want to live in a society where people are walking around carrying guns. You want to keep a gun at home for self-defense? The Heller decision allows you to do that. That's your choice. But I don't want to have to worry about a gun accidentally going off, about people getting into an argument, about all the things that happen, real world happen, road rage, you name it, too much to drink, whatever you can think of has happened and happens. I don't want to live in that society. And ironically, neither did the NRA, except, as you say, now that the conceal and carriers are Caucasians, that's okay with them.
Well, it's a very startling turnaround that a lot of people don't remember because it's quite a while ago that this happened. But, when you look at George Zimmerman and you look at Michael Dunn and you look at the popcorn murderer, the Skittles murderer, and the loud music murderer, that would not be tolerated for 1 minute, I believe, if they weren't white. And, consequently, we'd have new laws. So there's been a complete switch. And the irony is that the Black Power advocates back in the late 60s were saying very similar things about we don't trust the government. We don't trust the law enforcement people. We've got to defend ourselves. You know, real similar stuff to what we're hearing now, and the law's changed.
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out, and we'll talk about that in the upcoming period, both on our blogs, in person, and on our show. Right now, we have to take a break. Martha, thanks for visiting with me on the news. We'll come back to It's the Gun Stupid after this announcement and be speaking with Lois Schaefer. So stay with us, and we'll be right here when you get back.
There are many sounds in your day-to-day life. There are sounds that wake you up. Sounds that make you smile. Sounds that energize you. And sounds that help you relax. But there are some sounds that can alert you to danger and can help save lives. Wireless emergency alerts, now on many mobile devices, use a unique sound and vibration to bring you information about severe weather events, Amber Alerts, or other emergencies in your area. With critical information from local sources you know and trust, you can be in the know, wherever you are. For more information, visit ready.gov/alerts. Brought to you by FEMA and the Ad Council.
Packers,
Vikings,
Red State,
Blue State.
We come from different places.
Uptown,
Downtown.
We come to different conclusions.
half empty,
Half full.
But no matter how different we are, we're all connected, and we can all make a difference. That's why United Way brings people, expertise, and resources together to improve the education, income, and health of our communities, the building blocks for a better life. When we live united, our efforts, magnified by others, add up to real change. Children succeed in school, families gain financial stability, the health of our neighbors improves, and suddenly, so do our communities. But real change won't happen without you.
Live united.
So let's look beyond our differences.
Live united.
One by one, let's make a difference. Let's reach out a hand to one and influence the condition of all.
Live united.
Give, advocate, volunteer. Live United. Sign up today at liveunited.org. Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
As I started to say, though, our music was very prominent at that moment. We're back. Thanks for staying with us. We are now going to speak to a very dear person who I share a horrible bond with. We've both lost our adult children to gun violence, and it sent me on a path to found the National Gun Victims Action Council and essentially devote the rest of my life to seeing that we get sane gun laws. It sent Lois on a path to ultimately write a book, which is called The Unthinkable, and it is unthinkable for sure. Life, Loss, and a Mother's Mission to Ban Illegal Guns. Lois, hello, how are you?
I am all the better for speaking to you.
Well, how's the weather out in Long Island where you are?
It's the sun is shining, but it's a little chilly. But at least we don't have rain and snow.
It's been a cold spring, that's for sure. We're sitting here in the 50s in Chicago, which everyone is pleased with for the moment. But what I'd like to do, Lois, is to talk to you about 3 time frames of your life. What life was like before this horror, this tragic incident, and what happened as that was going on, and what's happened when you reached a place where you could function again. So tell us a little bit about you, about your life before, as when it was normal, I guess is the best way to say it.
I have always, before Susie died, I was always grateful for my life. I was very active. I taught for a while, taught dance for a while in Massachusetts, where I lived, in several places. Was a normal house life. Was very active politically. When I moved out to Great Neck, where I live now, and it was just a day to day, being very grateful for what it is that I had. And when I used to hear people say, "There's always a zinger that'll happen to everybody. Nobody is immune," and I thought to myself, yeah, I guess so. And then I got a zinger.
Well, I remember what President Kennedy's press secretary said, Larry O'Brien, I think was his name, on the day Kennedy was assassinated. He was on a plane going to Japan on a special mission. The plane turned around. He was interviewed when he came off the plane, and he said something that's always stayed with me, which was, being Irish, he said, we know that the world will always break your heart. We just thought we had more time. And I know I thought I had more time with my son, and I know you felt you had more time with your daughter as well. So tell me about that day, how you found out, what happened to the family. I know you had two daughters and a son.
She had two daughters and a son. The old Rachel was 3 at the time. Daniel was 17, and Sarah was 16, thereabouts. And it was a normal day in December, and it was cold. We had some snow, and the phone rings around 4:30, 4:45. It's my husband, David. He had just gotten a phone call from Susie's partner, significant other. His name is Alvin. And he said to him, "Terrible thing has happened to you. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but terrible thing has happened with Susie, and just stick by the phone." And I then get a phone call from David, who had conferenced me and my son that he had just gotten this message from Alvin, "Stick around." And I mean, David, who was not one to sound fearful, he sounded fearful, and there was kind of an ominous feeling. And then I hung up. A few minutes later, the phone rings, and it is David again, and he says, "Susie is gone." There were two teenagers who had broken into her house. She had just come home from work. Actually, she had done some shopping which I describe in my book. It was just an ordinary day for her. Was on the phone with Rachel, who lived in New York and still lives in New York, and they were just chatting on the phone about their lives and what was going on and the weather and the storms and the power outages. And Rachel heard what she describes in her book, these weird sounds, and the phone went dead.
Susie lived in St. Louis, I think.
Correct. Right. And mother and daughter were just on the phone talking. And it was then Daniel who had come back to the house, and he had gotten himself a haircut, came back to the house and walked
Daniel
in the
was
house.
Susie's son.
Correct. Who found her.
Oh, my God.
And immediately what it is that he did was he called 911, called Alvin, Susie's partner, and then called his father. She was divorced, at the time.
Right.
And that was it.
In an instant, all of these lives changed. A beautiful young life lost. I know Susie had just started her own business, hadn't she?
She had just within the year. She had always dreamed of owning her own business. She was so physically fit. And this is one of the things that I talk about. She was a runner, a swimmer, an athlete, a dancer. She was certified in Pilates, and then went beyond that and was certified in something that is even more difficult, gyrotonic. And she had finally opened her own business and was doing so well. People loved her. They ran to her. And she was put on, there's a television station in St. Louis, and she was interviewed by this interview on television station about gyrotonic, and it turned out that the person who interviewed her became one of her students.
Wow.
Now you talk about just in an instant in my book. I talk about the ordinary instant, and I lifted that out from Joan Didion's book, Things Happen in an Ordinary Instant. 9/11 was an ordinary instant in people's lives. There are other things that happened. For example, I talk about a professor, Roger Rosenblatt. While it wasn't gun violence, in an ordinary instant, his daughter, who was a young 38-year-old pediatrician, died while she was on the treadmill. Ordinary instant. And this was an ordinary instant.
Well, not ordinary that two teenagers come in with guns. That's what makes it not ordinary.
Yeah.
That's the point, and it's something that happens too often. It just happens too often, and kind of reminds me of that saying. I forgot who said it for the moment, that the face of evil is banal. It's so ordinary, and can you share with our listeners a little bit more about the actual event? About the what happened. As you describe it in great detail in the book, Susie had come back from shopping and had put the groceries on a counter, and then was talking with her sister, and
She was talking with her daughter.
her daughter. I mean, sorry.
Yes.
And
She had just walked into the house, and she walked into the house. There is kind of a laundry room that she walked through in there before you walked to the kitchen. And there was the shooter. I separated, there were two of them. One I call the non-shooter, and there is the shooter. Spotted the shooter, who was rummaging in her refrigerator, and she was shocked when she walked into her house.
These were high school kids?
These were high school kids, that is correct. And it was, what I started to say, she was so quick on her feet. It was over in seconds.
Well, I remember her daughter heard her say something like, "Who is it? What do you want? Who's there?"
No, what she said was, "What the hell is going on here?"
Oh, that's right. What the hell is going on here? And then there were two shots?
That there was one shot, she collapsed, and then there were three more, because the shooter wanted to be sure. When he was interviewed by the police, he didn't want her he didn't want her to identify him.
And what reason did he give? I mean, you're robbing a place, so okay, you want maybe some money, a cell phone, a TV. What reason did he have? I mean, they could have just left.
That's correct. They got a computer, they got a cell phone, a couple of other maybe things that belong to my grandchildren. That, yeah, you're right. They could have just taken that. But he had the gun. If you remember in the book, he had persuaded the non-shooter. Yeah, they were going to go out. They were going to get what they were going to get, and yeah, he had the gun. If anybody discovered them, well, he had the gun.
So it sounds like the shooter was intent on shooting someone.
That is correct. And if you also remember, he had said to the non-shooter, when they were running back to the house of where they were hanging out at the non-shooter, now you take the gun. I want you to know how it feels to shoot somebody. Yes. There are no words. All you can do is take a deep breath, sigh. There's nothing that you can say when somebody whom you love is so vicious. It's so unfair. And it's all because of the gun. If the gun weren't there, I think Susie would have been alive today.
Well, we have evidence of things like that. Recently there was this teenager who went berserk in a school in Pennsylvania and had a knife. And yes, he hurt a lot of people with his knife, but they're all alive. On the very day that the Sandy Hook massacre took place in China, there was a knife-wielding, maniac who went and slashed over 20 people, children as well. None of them died. So yes, a gun changes everything. A gun changes everything. And I've heard many stories where the shooter, the killer, said, well, I just wanted to know what it was like to kill someone. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine? I made we talked about this because I was struck by it in your book, the reaction of your son, and I believe your reaction as well. And then I'll share my reaction about what happened in the courtroom. The killer, the shooter, was brought to trial. They knew who the shooter was, and of course convicted and sentenced. And sitting in the courtroom, as is often the case, was the killer's mother. And I'd like you to share with our audience your son's reaction to it, because there's no rules for how to react, but this was a bit of a different reaction than many people have expressed. And actually, frankly, it was closer to the reaction I've had. So I was particularly in tune with it. But could you just share what happened after the conviction took place and you were leaving the courtroom?
Well, first of all, just let me say to you, thank God it was not a trial. It was a sentencing, because both the non-shooter and the shooter pled. Mm-hmm. If they did not plead, we would have had to have gone through a trial. Would have meant that both Rachel and Daniel, Rachel, who was on the phone, who heard the gunshots, and Daniel, who found her, would have had to have testified, which would have meant they would have had to have, in spades, gone through the whole horror again. Now, not dreadful. That it wasn't horrible, the sentencings, at least they didn't have to verbalize to a judge, to an attorney, to the prosecutor. They didn't have to do that.
Thank goodness. Now, thank goodness.
We have to emphasize what is, not what is not. But anyway, walking out of the shooter's sentencing. In the book I see this woman in this huge courtroom sitting across way across from me. And there we all were. My husband David, Alvin, Alvin's sister, her husband, her brother-in-law, his sister's children. There were a number of us. And there was they call her the victims coordinator, who we developed a very warm relationship. And I kept seeing this woman looking over to me. And we each made our impact statements. And when it was time for Eric to get up to make his impact statement, I saw this woman across the way, looking and then looking away, and then burying her head in her hand, and and then really slinking down. And I said to the victims coordinator, "Is that the mother?" And she said that she wasn't sure, but she thought so, because this mother had never come to any of his hearings, whatever they do. And it turned out that, yes, it was the mother. So you asked the question about what happened. We're all filing out after the judge had formally sentenced him. And the mother, I see the mother walking towards me, and I am the last one out, and right before me, as we're walking out of the courtroom, this woman says to me, "I want to talk to you." And I just stopped for a minute, and I thought, she said, "I want to talk to you. Please forgive. God forgives. Forgive him. I'm a single mother. Please, over and over. Please forgive." Whereupon Eric was almost out of the door, outside into where the lobby is, into the courtroom. He turns around on his heels and he says to her, "Shut up. God has nothing to do with this, and I will never forgive." And I absolutely agree with that. Do I feel sorry for that mother? Sure I do. But there has to be something in that background that made him use this violence. So there's no forgiveness as far as I am concerned. So, but what it is that I do is don't emphasize that. I focus on what it is that I can do. And that was one of the reasons that I wrote the book. I wanted to bring this message out for society to do something.
Well, the message that you bring, Lois, is so touching, and it's so much more impactful than just hearing a statistic that somebody lost their life, somebody was murdered, or groups of people. We say 8 children a day are murdered with guns. It's a statistic. But to hear a mother talk about, as you do, and write about, as you did, her daughter's life, to see the pictures in the book, it makes it so real for people who've not gone through it. And for me, I just want to show the book again. For me, who has gone through it, it was a very hard book to read because it brought back so much. I too don't forgive. My position with my son's murderer is I've really, as I told you, I don't know the name anymore. You know, I don't want that name in my head. I just refer to him as the murderer when I have to. He won't get out of jail ever because he too pled, and he'll be in jail. The earliest he could come up for parole, he'll be in his hundreds, so that won't be happening. But in the impact statement I wrote, I too held the parents responsible. This was a young man, I would found out from the DA who prosecuted the case. This was a young man who everyone knew while growing up had very serious mental problems, just as the killer in Sandy Hook, everybody knew about that, as well as the Aurora killer, by the way. Everyone knew that they did, and the Phoenix killer, the one who shot Gabby Giffords. Everyone in their world knew that this was not a stable person. But the parents of my son's killer never took him for mental treatment. They just let him grow that way. And when he was older, he twice committed himself to a mental institution, but was still legally able to buy a gun and kill my son. So I held the parents responsible, and I still do. And the question of, do I forgive the killer? No. I don't. The killer doesn't appear in my mind anymore. They're done. They'll never do this to anyone again, and that was all I cared about. Lois, I wish I was out in Long Island with you. I would take you out for a drink or tea or something, and let's just say that'll be something we'll look forward to. We need to stick together and go on with this weight that will never be let go. Some days are better than others. Recently, it was my son's birthday, and it was just a dreadful couple of days as that birthday came and went. And I know that it is for you too. So lots of love. Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm sure this was painful to talk about, but thank you so much for your book, The Unthinkable, A Mother's Life Lost in a Mother's Mission to Ban Illegal Guns by Lois Schaefer. And if you really want to understand what gun violence is about, read Lois's book. Okay, I think we need to take a break now. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes, and we'll be speaking with Kyle Copeland, who is the founder of the organization Armed Citizens Project.
Today might be the day I drop out of school. Today could be the last day I try. My parents alone can't stop me. My friends can't even stop me. But you might be able to. With United Way, you could tutor me, be my mentor, or volunteer to just read with me. If someone had helped me earlier, I might not be struggling. And studies prove that kids who read well by 3rd grade are more likely to graduate. There are tons of ways people like you can help kids like me stay in school. And United Way is calling for you to be one of them. Because it takes 12 years to create a graduate. It takes about the same time to create a dropout. And the difference between me becoming one or the other could be you. Make me a success, not a statistic.
Take the pledge to volunteer now at unitedway.org. Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
Let me tell you who to blame. Blame the boy lying at your feet, his body oozing life through the hole in his stomach where the bullet tore him apart. Blame him for challenging you, for not looking away and for not backing down when you pulled out the gun. Blame your mother for bringing you into this world when she was but a kid herself and for dragging you up, not bringing you up. Blame society for not giving you hope. Blame your father for not being there, the man who looked after himself instead of looking after you. Blame the gun in your hand for making you a target, for making you more likely to be picked on. Blame the dead boy, blame your mother, blame society, blame your father, blame the gun, blame anyone but yourself for not being strong enough to put down the gun, to break the cycle.
Well, we're back from our break. It's the Gun Stupid radio show. You're listening to Elliot Fineman, CEO of Gun Victims Act, National Gun Victims Action Council. And our next guest is a young man, Kyle Copeland, who has launched an interesting experiment and founded concurrently, when he launched that experiment, a group called the Armed Citizen Project. Kyle, are you here? Are you hearing me?
Yeah, hey Elliot, thanks for having me on.
Okay, thanks for being here. I'm reading from something from your website about what the Armed Citizen Project is, and it is, as described here, dedicated to facilitating the arming of law-abiding citizens and analyzing the relationship between increased firearm availability and rates. And what you've done is you've chosen in Houston, and I think in Phoenix as well, some mid to high crime areas, and have advanced the proposition that by arming people with shotguns to protect their home, I presume that they're not walking around with them, is not your experiment, you feel that it will show that the gun violence and the home invasions will go down. I think I remember reading or listening to an interview you gave where the place in Houston had 107 home invasions, I believe, the year prior to your launching this experiment. And when, by the way, I think you launched this in March of 2013, is that correct?
Yeah, that's when we first started training and arming our first class. I had the idea last January after I visited the home of a World War II veteran whose home was badly vandalized. 93-year-old man with two Purple Hearts who had just lost his wife 57 years, weeks prior, drove himself to the doctor's appointment one morning and returned home to find his house had been ransacked and spray painted and vandalized. And I was a part of the community effort that came out to support and fix his home up. And when I walked through, it really lit a fire in me, and I started thinking about private solutions to the public problem of home invasion crime. And the solution I landed on was let's train and arm residents of high-crime neighborhoods with free pump-action shotguns. Once we arm enough, we put signage up letting criminals know they're at an increased risk of death. And I'm doing a multi-year, multi-city policy study on the results. So, it's something that'll take 3 to 5 years to get out there, the end result of the data. But we've armed a little over 100 folks so far, and we've trained about 240. So, we're really excited about the future.
Well, one thing I really appreciate about what you're doing, though, I'd be happy to make a bet on the outcome, but we don't have to go into there right now. But what I appreciate you're doing is approaching this in a way that makes sense to anyone who, has any science background. I know your background is in a public administration. I think you have an advanced degree in that. And the key for setting policy or for any scientific research is to get data, is to get real data instead of opinions. And what I like that you're doing here is you're trying to, set up an experiment and collect the data and then draw conclusions. we're trying to set up an experiment out here. The NRA has refused to participate in it, and I'll talk about it later, but we've set up an experiment to show that conceal and carrying does not offer self-defense for people walking around. But I want to stay with your experiment right now, or research, whatever you want to call it. Have you had any preliminary results from this?
Yeah, just anecdotally and monitoring the crime reports. We didn't get that entire neighborhood here in Houston actually fully armed until about August of last year. And so, it's going to take some time, but we've seen a decrease in the area. But with my data, one of the reasons why, as a policy guy, you have to look at several different areas, and the larger sample you have, the better. This neighborhood has had a crime problem for a while. Area that we chose 400 houses. They had 107 home invasions last year. So I need to be sure not to make any presumptions, because as their invasion rate has increased, the neighborhood has taken additional steps. The broader Oak Forest community, there's a private organization, Seal Security. It's a pay for, they travel around the neighborhood. So there's been some other steps that have been taken. And so as a policy guy, I know that, I can say anecdotally we've absolutely seen an impact, but I'm focused on the long term, coming out with a multi-year, multi-city policy study that really we're going to kind of force down the throats of academia and the peer review process. Because up until now, if we look at Kennesaw, Georgia, as an example of, when guns are a good thing and deter crime, we point to Chicago as, gun laws gone bad. We see that as evidence, but the anti-gun left always says, well, they're individual cities, they could be outliers, there's cultural variables and these variables and this and that you need to take into account. And so what I'm looking to do is, by setting up these neighborhoods across the country in different areas where we are training and arming new responsible gun owners and then putting the signage up, I think that we'll be able to absolutely prove a correlation, if not a causal link, in the future. And it just depends on if we can get a sample big enough, and if we can expand large enough. I'm confident, because we all know that criminals don't want to die in your hallway. That's pretty much one of their foremost concerns.
That's one of the interesting things. We had, by the way, I live in Chicago, and I really don't accept the criticism that the pro-gun, your side, throws out, that here we had strong gun laws and look at the crime rate, the murder rate, because as far as I say, we've had no gun laws. And the reason we've had no gun laws is because we can't pass laws to stop trafficking. There is many guns on the street as there would be if we didn't have a single law. The only way we could really get guns out of the crime neighborhoods, out of the, gangs and so on and so forth, the inner city where a lot of the murders take place in Chicago, would be to stop trafficking. But the NRA, for reasons that took me a while to find out, opposes any law that would stop trafficking, because ironically, 25%, 1/4 of the industry's market goes to the criminal market. It's 25% of the gun industry sales each year goes to criminals, and anything that would make it harder to go for guns to go to criminals is something the NRA is opposed to. But you're doing something that I've always asked about, and it makes sense to me.
I disagree with that 25% number, though. You go to a gun show and you see hundreds of transactions happening, and how many of those folks that use CHLs at gun shows to do the purchases are absolutely on the up and up. I think a 25% number, that to me sounds extremely high.
Well, I can tell you where the number came from. In 1998 rather, the NAACP sued the gun industry for the practices they had and have that allowed guns to get into the hands of criminals, and all the damage that was, horror taking place there in the inner cities. So as part of that suit, they had an expert witness, as one always does. And this was a very classy expert witness, one that the judge commended, for the diligence of this firm's work. And that's where the number came from. We have the 25%. We have one of our advisors worked with the ATF for 30 years, and he said, Elliot, the number's closer to 30%. I think the number's right because another thing is that criminals, use their gun for a crime and throw it away to buy a new one. So I think the number's correct. And it's not the topic of our show, but what I did want to comment on two things you're doing that I would like to see done all over. One is that you said momentarily that you notify the neighborhood. I guess people who you've given guns to put up a sign saying, this home's protected or something.
Well, we don't identify the specific
that
home.
This home is protected, much the
to be
same
feeling
way,
like-
I guess, that someone who has a guard dog or an electronic monitoring service, puts up a sign. The gun owners I've spoken to in talks I've given or in debates that I've been taken part of, and even in an incident here where they wanted to publish the names of people who had guns in the newspaper, everybody freaked out and said, absolutely not. We don't want the criminals to know we have guns. They'll come and steal them. And I keep saying, if the gun is there for self-defense, why wouldn't you put up a sign saying you have a gun there for self-defense? Well, they don't, but you do. So is this a sign that goes in, on the house, or is it just like a neighborhood sign?
Yeah, we don't want criminals to know which homes that we've trained and armed. We want them to be feeling like they're playing Russian roulette with their lives anytime they go to commit a home invasion crime in a neighborhood. And that also provides spillover benefits to the folks that don't participate. So we don't identify which homes we trained and armed. And another thing that we do is we stagger up our training. So like I said, we armed 50 in the neighborhood here in Houston. We did that over 5 separate classes, 10 per class. So even the folks in the neighborhood weren't entirely sure of who else took part.
Okay. Well, there's another thing you do that I'm for, and that is you have trigger locks or something so that only the gun owner can fire the gun. Is that correct?
Well, we give them coded padlocks that they can use behind the trigger. It goes in between the trigger and the trigger guard, and it renders it inoperable. But we advise them they can use that as they see fit. Me personally, I don't lock my firearms. I don't have a need to. I don't have children in my home, and we advise people based on their situation that they may want to. And they're also coded locks, and so they can have them 1 or 2 digits off and get to access them somewhat quickly. But it's always, I say it's kind of a personal preference, and depending on your personal situation at home and with your kids on whether or not you lock your firearms.
So this is not a lock I've heard of. I've heard of smart guns being available.
No, this is a master lock. It's just a coded.
This is just a lock,
padlock.
a physical lock, not a smart gun.
No, those aren't even available.
Okay. Well, smart guns are available, but the gun industry is opposed to them.
If you have $7,500 and you're willing to risk a second delay in the trigger firing, absolutely, I guess. But for the average person, it's certainly priced out of their ability to purchase.
Well, A, it's not $7,500 at all. It's about $15 to put one in. And B, if your life depends on a split second, you don't have a chance. because the reality, and this is one of the things I do want to talk about, is that the element of surprise always defeats the gun carrier. So if you have your gun and it's at the ready and someone bursts into your home, into your bedroom, you're done. You're not going to reach for your gun. If you hear somebody break into your house and you can surprise them, sure, you'll be the winner. But if it comes down to a split second, I mean, that's just not real world. That's not going to happen in the real world.
Well,
What I did
it
want to
happens
ask
in the real
you
world all the
is,
time when criminals kick in a bedroom door and the person responds. The situation where that you're talking about is in the form of an assassin walking in with the direct intention of putting a gun to your head and pulling the trigger, and that's not very real world. The average person, if they get surprised by a criminal, you absolutely want to be able to reach for that gun. You want to be able to practice and to know that if a situation happens, that you're going to be able to respond accordingly. And so training is a big part of it, being familiar with the firearm and familiar with using it in a potentially stressful situation.
I'm sure you're familiar with the McDonald case at the Supreme Court. It was the one that followed the Heller case.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of actually appearing on a show. There's a show here called Chicago Tonight with Mr. McDonald, a very pleasant guy, an older African American. We had something in common. He had lost his son to cancer. I had lost my son to gun violence. But a delightful guy. We were on the show. He said all of his reasons why he lived in a neighborhood that had become high crime. He was afraid to go out. He needed a gun, and Chicago at that point banned handguns, and he said he needed a handgun for self-defense. Gave all of his reasons. I made my observations that I don't believe carrying a gun provides self-defense because it can't defend against the element of surprise. So we had our talk. Afterwards, we're sitting around. This is really an interesting story I'm sharing with you, Kyle. We were sitting around, and the guy who conducted the interview, we were all sitting around a table chatting. Mr. McDonald's daughter had brought him there because he couldn't drive by this point. And he said to Mr. McDonald, he asked him, he said, well, have you ever pulled out your gun to defend yourself? And Mr. McDonald looked at him as if he was crazy. He said, are you crazy? They'd kill me. And he said that that in the neighborhood where he lived, if he went to the supermarket and he saw some gangbangers or tough people and they were harassing him or in any way he felt threatened, the last thing he would do is pull out his gun. And he said that he never had pulled it out. So I'm not sure, and this happens often too. Just sharing with you, and maybe you can comment on it. When I give a talk, often after the end of the talk, people on the pro-gun side will come up and say we're not taking away the right for them to carry their gun and defend themselves and their family, and they rant a bit and they get in my face. And then after they're done, I ask them a simple question, and I'll ask it to you. Describe a scenario. Give me an actual scenario, that you could describe where you would use your gun or your gun would defend you in terms of a criminal situation, an assailant coming at you, and how would you, an assailant with a gun coming at you, and how you would defend yourself.
Sure. Well, let me comment on Mr. McDonald first. I think that it's a sign of success and a sign of the actual mindset of folks that conceal carry, that when they are somewhere where they're being harassed or there's a potential for violence, we understand that we don't want to escalate that. And there are times where, everything's a judgment call. Just because someone's concealed carrying a firearm doesn't mean they're the Texas millionaire from The Simpsons that waves his gun half-cocked in the air shooting all the time. And that's simply not the case. And so what we've seen is with FBI statistics, they estimate around 2.5 million times a year that firearms are used to stop a crime. So I could give you 2.5 million different examples. I've used my firearm to stop someone from stealing my vehicle before.
You've used your firearm. Excuse me, I lost you. To do what?
I prevented someone from stealing my vehicle with my concealed carry piece.
So you were coming back to your car, and someone was apparently trying to break into your car, and you flashed your gun, and they went away. Did you let them off? Did you arrest them? Did you just scare them off, and that was it?
No, I got them to stop what they were doing. I let them know that I was going to call the police, but I didn't know if he had warrants. I didn't know what he'd do to go back to jail, to not have to go back to jail or whatever. And I used my judgment, and I said, I don't feel like escalating this. I'm going to let him go, and I'm going to call the police after, because I did not feel like getting into escalating it and putting myself in a worse position. But I did what I needed to retain my property. And I'm convinced that if I wouldn't have had my firearm, I would have lost my vehicle.
Well, that's true. You probably would have lost your vehicle, but you might have also lost your life by having your firearm. This two and a half million, this 2.5 million number that is thrown out based on Kleck and Lott's work, to me, is an utter fiction. The FBI figures show that it's about. No, I mean, and this, we're going to have John Lott on the show a little, in down the line, because there's one thing I know a lot about, and that's the scientific method. I have an engineering degree from MIT, and I know what science is and what science is not. And there's nothing in Lott's work or in Kleck's work either, that stands up to appropriate scientific protocol. But I just want to make a comment that the FBI, in their uniform crime report each year, reports that there's something under 400 defensive uses of guns, where people had the guns and defended themselves. And most of them were store owners, where somebody burst into the store and was going to rob them. I wouldn't take your example. I'm taking your example, as I'm sure the event happened just as you described it, but I wouldn't call that an example of you defending yourself with your gun. You defended your property, and you might have lost your life.
About a personal situation. I talk to people all the time. When I first founded Armed Citizen Project, there was a 20-year-old out in Katy who I happened to visit a week after the incident happened, who two criminals tried forcing their way into their home because they had bad information that house had money there for some reason, and they ordered his mom and dad to lay down on the floor face down. He went to the bedroom, got the gun. One of them came around the corner to get him out into the living room, and he fired and shot and killed one of the intruders. The other two left and fled and were caught maybe 30 minutes later. And so I have a situation right there where talking to that kid, he was convinced that his family was going to be put down. And he's alive today, and one of them's not, and I think that's a net benefit.
And I think that is, a story where people do have guns at home for self-defense, and we've all heard the statistics about how it increases other dangers, why there's resistance to storing the guns safely so that kids can't get them and kill themselves is, another bewildering thing. But, the other side of that, of your story, that you just shared with us is In Cold Blood. When Truman Capote wrote In Cold Blood, the family, the Hendersons, lived in a very remote area. There weren't many houses around. They lived in a big farm area. And they were absolutely loaded to the gills with guns, and they were all of them, the parents and the daughter and son, were skilled, shooters. They really knew how to use these things. But the element of surprise by the intruder, they couldn't overcome it. So that was one situation where, the situations at home are very personal. I have a cousin who lives in California. and he's built a room that their bedroom is locked in such a way that nobody can get in. And if they do get in, if they try to break in, he's got enough time to go to his gun safe or his gun box and get his gun and so on. So home is a different story. But I think one thing, and I have confidence you'll do this, Kyle, I think one thing you need to do is to control the experiment, for the variables. Like you mentioned, there's a private security firm that changes the nature of the results. In order to make it, any scientific conclusion, the results have to be controlled for all those variables, and it will be interesting. I would like to speak to you before 5 years are up. You said it would take 4 or 5 years to get the results, but it'd be interesting to see how this unfolds.
Yeah, and we're not. I consider the experiment to actually be ancillary. We're first and foremost consider ourselves a charitable nonprofit that's training and arming new responsible gun owners. About half the folks that we've trained and armed haven't been within the specific neighborhoods. They've been folks that have been single women, single mothers, a lot of folks who are disabled. One of our biggest volunteers was a woman we trained and armed who has an autistic child who lives near kind of where a lot of transients gather, and not a very safe neighborhood. So we're first and foremost a charitable nonprofit creating new responsible gun owners. But at the same time, by deterring crime in these neighborhoods, I'm able to do, I have my master's in public administration. I'm a policy analyst, and so it's kind of my personal project to do the multi-year, multi-city study. But we're first and foremost a charitable organization.
Well, I think you're embarking on a question that needs to be answered scientifically, not by anecdote or by opinion. And let's see where this leads. I think we would all agree we'd like society to be safer. The people on our side feel that society is safer where there's sane gun laws. We don't talk about no guns. We talk about sane gun laws. The only people who talk about no guns and taking all your guns away is the NRA. No one on our side's ever uttered those words. But then the NRA says, well, we really feel that way, but we just don't say it. But the point is, we feel that without sane gun laws, guns are not safe and the public's not safe. And as for me, if you want to have a gun at home, do it. But I don't want to myself. I'm just giving you my point is I don't want to live in a society where I go, people are carrying guns. So I don't want people carrying guns outside of their home.
Well, there's concealed carry everywhere now, so I don't know where you're going to move to, because even in Illinois, y'all have had to adopt concealed carry. So that's the new reality of firearms.
Well, we're going to do something about it,
we've actually been winning in the pro-gun
you'll watch and see. But I know that's the the goal of the gun carriers. We did this once, in Dodge City. Everybody carried guns everywhere they went, and
we don't want everyone to carry guns. We just want people to be able to carry guns.
Well, and some of them will. And some of them will have accidents, and some of them will get angry, and a whole bunch of things will happen that wouldn't happen if people didn't have guns. But anyway, that's a subject.
With the CHL is 5 times less likely to commit a crime as another law-abiding citizen. That's criminals taken completely out of the equation. The people that are carrying guns are the best that we have in society. They're out there looking out for others, and that are being prepared and are not going to let their families go to the slaughter. And so these are good Americans who just want to protect themselves. And we're not necessarily always carrying. It's just we want to be able to, given certain situations, whenever we use our own judgment and feel it's in our best interest. And I think that creating new responsible gun owners is always a good thing. And with the kids, if we look at the data, 2011, the last year the numbers are out there, 36 kids under the age of 10 were accidentally shot and killed. 2/3 of those were by adult males with criminal histories or drug and alcohol problems. So 90 times a year, a kid under 5 drowns in a 5-gallon bucket. I don't have.
Yeah,
to pass a
I
background
don't
check, or I
accept
can
the
buy
de
multiple
minimis
at Home Depot.
argument. You know, when 4 people get salmonella because of tomato soup, they recall millions of cans. I don't, so I don't accept that. But at any rate, Kyle, we have to go. We'd like to continue this discussion down the line. I'd like to see the results of the experiment. And just as you will know because of your background, to just adjust for the variables that might impact it. And thanks for being on the show,
I wouldn't
and
have brought it
we'll
up if I
touch
weren't
base
gonna
down the
adjust
line.
for it. I'm really interested in this being a serious multi-year, multi-city study that passes every muster for peer review process. I'm a serious policy analyst, and I don't think any manipulation's even needed. If I were biased towards this study, it's the numbers that we've already seen, the most comprehensive studies we've seen. Not the Arthur Kellerman covering 3 counties, the John Lott and Gary Kleck work that covers national stats, is the best work out there, despite what some say.
Well, the John Lott work, in my opinion, is a fiction, but let's save that for another time. Anyway, thanks, Kyle, and enjoy the evening, and I'm sure we'll talk again. Okay, we've been chatting with Kyle Copeland, the founder of the Armed Citizens Project, and I think we're going to take a break now, and I'd like to come back at the end and just make a couple of statements about something I call the Wyoming problem. If we take a break, I will do it then, or if I'm waiting for my producer to say we're taking a break or I should just continue. And since I haven't gotten a message to take a break, I'll just continue. Wait, this sounds like a break.
There are many sounds in your day-to-day life. There are sounds that wake you up. Sounds that make you smile. Sounds that energize you. And sounds that help you relax. But there are some sounds that can alert you to danger and can help save lives. Wireless emergency alerts, now on many mobile devices, use a unique sound and vibration to bring you information about severe weather events, Amber Alerts, or other emergencies in your area. With critical information from local sources you know and trust, you can be in the know, wherever you are. For more information, visit ready.gov/alerts. Brought to you by FEMA and the Ad Council.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Okay, we're back, and we're back on It's the Gun Stupid, our radio show, National Gun Victims Actions radio show, bi-weekly, and one where we kind of say it like it is, and we do talk about the hard things. One of the things that came out this week was this tremendous coalition between Mayor Bloomberg's organization, Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and its new partner, Moms Demand Action. And Mayor Bloomberg and Moms Demand Action are pooling their assets, his a lot of money and some know-how, and Mom's skills at public relations and mobilizing grassroots participants. And their goal is to organize a couple of million people to cast their votes only for those politicians who support sane gun laws. I completely applaud what they're doing. I completely support it. It's intelligent. It's needed. We need to combat the other side if we're going to have sane gun laws. But I do want to point out that the issue that needs to be solved strategically, in other words, assuming you could wave the magic wand and they could do all of that and have 10 million people doing it or 15, the issue is what I call the Wyoming problem, because we're not going to get sane gun laws until we solve the Wyoming problem. And the work that this new group, Every Town for Gun Safety, is doing, brilliant and wonderful and needed as it is, will not solve the Wyoming problem. We're doing something with our Tell and Compel pledge, and I urge everybody who's interested in sane gun laws to come to our website, www.gunvictimsaction.org, and sign the Tell and Compel pledge. But the Tell and Compel pledge drives from the Wyoming problem, and let me just describe it, because many of you may know that before my son was murdered, I had my own practice. I was a strategic marketing advisor to Fortune 500 companies, and there's one thing I know cold, and that's strategy. And here's the strategic issue. Let's assume for a moment that the entire United States consisted of two states, California and Wyoming. And let's further assume that California, with its 38 million people, that all 38 million of them wanted universal background checks. And let's assume that in Wyoming, that all 1 million people in Wyoming, that's what they have, 1 million, all of them did not want universal background checks. So we could absolutely say precisely that 38 out of 39 million Americans want universal background checks, almost 99%. But would that mean we would have universal background checks? Well, the only way we could have them is if we had 3 senators voting for them. California would have 2 senators, as they do now. Wyoming would have 2 senators. And certainly the 2 senators in California would support universal background checks. But the 2 senators in Wyoming, coming from a place where nobody wanted universal background checks, would not. So we couldn't have them unless we could move one of or both of these senators from Wyoming to want universal background checks. The notion that we can vote them out and vote people in who want them is not realistic in a place where most of the people don't want universal background checks. But by the way, this is what I'm describing is a structural flaw in the way we're set up, that the voices of 1 million people can drown out the voices of 38 million. But that said, that's how the founding fathers set it up, and that's how it is. So the question is, you can't vote the people out who are opposed to universal background checks, the 2 senators, and replace them with ones who want them in that situation. And unfortunately, in many states, that's the real world. So that the effort of the Every Town Wants Gun Safety, in my view, could not overcome that problem. With Tell and Compel, which we hope to be doing in conjunction with what is being done by Every Town Wants Gun Safety, we can. And the way we would do this is that we would literally, when we have enough people having signed the Tell and Compel pledge, there's 100 million Americans that want sane gun laws, so we just need some reasonable percentage of you to sign the Tell and Compel pledge by going to our website. Then we can make clear to Wyoming that until one of their senators supports universal background checks for our 15 or 20 million people who have signed the pledge, Wyoming doesn't exist. We won't go there. Tourism will be not, part of our world. If they have anything that they make, Wyoming doesn't really have agriculture. I don't think there are any corporate headquarters located there. But if there were, we wouldn't do business with them. In other words, we can cause economic harm to Wyoming, and we'll do it. And then the senator in Wyoming that we need to change could get up and say something along the lines that universal background checks since the dawn of mankind this is the worst idea that's ever been proposed. But because he has to protect the state's economy, there's nothing he can do. He has to vote for them. And he'd probably keep his job, and it'd be a win-win deal all around. We would get that third senator. We'd get universal background checks. He'd keep his job. End of story. So we urge you to sign the Tell and Compel pledge to position us to overcome the Wyoming problem, without which it doesn't matter how many people are supporting the gun laws, supporting universal background checks. If we don't solve the Wyoming problem, we'll never get them, and we can. It's in our hands. We have a winning hand here. We can solve it. So join us. Come to our website, www.gunvictimsaction.org. Sign the Tell and Compel pledge and get positioned when we call for action to solve the Wyoming problem. And it might be Florida that we're going after at that time. We'll pick our place when we're ready. Okay, thanks for listening. It's always a pleasure having guests on our show, talking pretty strongly about things, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Take care.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.